Hello and welcome to Cyberside Chats. My name is Sherri Davidoff. I'm the founder of LMG Security.
And I am Matt Duran, the Director of Training and Research for LMG Security.
And today we're going to talk about how, according to headlines, the FBI hacked thousands of computers to make malware uninstall itself. So this is a pretty exciting headline, kind of designed to get a reaction. Matt, why don't you tell us what happened, and then we'll talk about how the FBI has actually been doing this for a long time.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious. The FBI hacked over 4,000 people. No, the
Computers,
yeah. The FBI used some technological trickery to get rid of a piece of malware called PlugX. And PlugX is a remote access Trojan that's used by a lot of nation-state groups. It's a keylogger, it's a data stealer, it steals credentials. It's a pretty nasty piece of software.
And it originates out of China.
Originates
correct?
out of China,
Yeah.
allegedly, yeah. But yeah, the FBI was able to take over part of their infrastructure and was able to then use that access to, fortunately, delete that from a bunch of people's computers, which, I mean, there are good and bad things about that, which we'll talk about today. But yeah, that's generally the gist of it.
Yeah, I mean, for those of you out there who work in law enforcement, first, thank you for the work that you guys do.
Yeah.
Because, again, this is a tactic that has been used in security for well over a decade. I mean, you see cases in 2010 and 2011 when the FBI, when Microsoft, when other law enforcement agencies are working together to take down these major botnets.
Yeah.
But for the organizations whose computers are getting modified, there are both ethical and real concerns regarding operational impact, potential data breaches, things like that. And frankly, people may not want the FBI coming into their computers. So why don't we talk a little bit about the history of this and some of the pros and cons and practical things that we need to think about as part of our incident response programs.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea. I mean, there are problems with this that we'll get into as we go. And I mean, the FBI is not the only one that did this. French law enforcement, some other international law enforcement agencies did this.
With the PlugX
with PlugX specifically, yeah. I mean, so they're not alone. But when they did this, I mean, it's not like they just went in and like plucked out the virus or something like that. I mean, they actually altered file system stuff. They changed registry keys.
Interesting.
Yeah, they added temporary scripts. They deleted files. Like, there are several things that, I mean, if I'm looking at a computer and trying to figure out if it's been hacked, I mean, that would potentially look like malicious activity to me. And if I didn't know the FBI had just been in there, that's going to freak me out a little bit. Just going to be honest about that one.
Well, and I know when you and I were talking, the first thing we both thought of was, oh my gosh, this is the same thing that happened as part of the Exchange vulnerability. When Microsoft Exchange was vulnerable, then we saw a big operation by law enforcement to come in and remove web shells, correct?
Right. Yeah, no, the FBI, I think it was 2021, they went through and, for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about here, this is the proxy logon vulnerability that like exploded around the world in 2021.
So criminals hacked into people's computers and they dropped web shells. So the FBI did not come in and patch the vulnerability. What they did was they removed a specific type of web shell that they said would be very difficult for the owners to find because the naming convention wasn't always the same and things like that. So they went in, they removed that, and they also made a copy of that for evidentiary purposes. So again, this was in 2021. We didn't see that in the current PlugX case.
No, I don't think so.
Right, but we did see that in 2021. So what are your concerns about this?
Yeah, so there's a few. So first and foremost, I mean, it's the FBI logging into your Exchange server without telling you they're doing it.
Right,
which
using
is,
the malware to log
Using the malware to log into your Exchange server. No, there were a few concerns about this. One was the fact that they went in and they deleted this web shell, and yeah, they took an evidentiary copy of it, but they then had to go about like notifying people who they had just gone into that their servers had been accessed and that this web shell had been found. And if you didn't have correct contact information or if you weren't like publicly listed, you may not even know that, one, you were infected in the first place, and two, that the FBI had been there. And then the second thing is how they did it. So like you said, they didn't patch anything. They didn't really fix anything except for removing that one very specific piece of software. So if somebody had already been in your server, if they had deployed keyloggers, or if they had deployed a remote access Trojan or something like that, that's all still there.
Right.
And so further on down the road, if I'm an IT security guy and I'm now realizing like, oh, I need to scan to see if I'm impacted by this, and I run Microsoft's tool, I don't see the web shell anymore. Like, I don't know that I've been hit in the first place, and so I might not know that other malware's on there.
Right, and the malware's gone, so even if there's evidence that you might have been hit, you can't analyze that malware to determine what it could have done.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no information about what the malware was capable of.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, when law enforcement removes a copy of malware for evidentiary purposes, you see the reason they do that because they're trying to understand what the malware is capable of, how that might affect our infrastructure. But at the same time, we've seen in cases like the Target hack that malware can even contain sensitive information. In Target, there was malware uploaded to a third party, I believe it was VirusTotal.
VirusTotal, yeah.
And that malware contained information about the internal IP address infrastructure. I think in some cases it may have had links to where copies of credit card numbers were stored, so file systems and directories. So it's entirely possible for certain types of malware to contain sensitive information about your organization as well. So that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, we saw that with the Snake ransomware. Remember there was
Yes,
that call out to the internal Honda
that's right,
domain?
the
Yeah,
Honda Snake ransomware case.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've also seen not just law enforcement doing this. Microsoft has historically done takedowns of this type as well. And in fact, Matt and I were just looking at a video of Operation B49, where Microsoft, they go through this whole explanation, and we'll put a link in the show notes, this whole explanation about the legal justification and how they were able to legally take down this botnet. And then from a technical perspective as well, how they went in and did it. So starting in 2010, they were taking action. And then in 2013, they took down Citadel. And that's a great example where Microsoft, again, actually pushed out a configuration update to these infected computers. So you have a private company, not just law enforcement, you have a private company that is potentially making changes to infected systems, which has some ramifications.
Yeah, there's issues with that. And I mean, Microsoft's done this, or Microsoft and the FBI have both done this. I mean, we saw Emotet just a couple of years ago. I mean, their infrastructure was taken over, and then a self-destruct command was sent out to the actual Emotet malware. But again, if you don't know that's happening, or if you, so with like PlugX as the example, there's mention of this. A lot of the people who are infected with PlugX don't realize they're infected with it. And so we're relying on that notification to let you know that, okay, you probably need to do an investigation now. And if that's not there, then, I mean, you could have suffered a data breach and not even known it, which is pretty unfortunate. Same with all these other efforts. That's why paying attention to when these things happen becomes like super, super important. Like you need to know what's going on around you.
Well, you mentioned threat intelligence is key. I wanted to mention also in PlugX, the FBI did do notification, but the way they're doing it is by contacting your ISP. So if you were a victim, if they did remove the PlugX malware, they're going to notify the internet service provider where that IP address is hosted. And then they're relying on your internet service provider to notify you, which makes sense because presumably your ISP is the local ISP is tracking the contact information. But then the question becomes, how reliable is this? How organized is your internet service provider? Do they have the correct contact information for you? All of those questions come up.
Yeah, I've worked with organizations before where we've been trying to contact their tech vendors, and the contact information they have for the company is like an old employee who left the company a couple of years ago or something like that. So is that email getting forwarded off somewhere? Is somebody who actually knows what that means going to get that email? And these things are important to take a look at. And it doesn't take that much time to verify your contact info. But
well, at LMG, when we do penetration tests, we always verify the ownership of the IP address. And we used to do that by contacting, in fact, our step one is to contact the internet service provider. But frankly, especially when you start looking all around the world, that can be very difficult to do. And that's in cases where we're authorized to do that, and we have the support of the person who's actually owning the IP address. So in this case, where the person who's operating that server has no idea, I think that could become a real challenge.
Oh, yeah, it totally could. And it's, if nothing else, it's just a pain to work through. Like, you have to go through their customer service. It's a problem.
I'd be curious to know, like, if I could wave my magic wand and get all the data, I would be curious to know what percentage of people who were impacted by this FBI operation actually received a notification, and then what percentage of those people received a notification to the right person who was then able to actually make the organization aware of it.
That'd be really interesting.
That's another issue. It probably went to some spam box,
Well, I mean, it did say it came from the official FBI email account.
Oh, so, I'm so glad you pointed that out. So with the PlugX malware, we see in some of the press releases that the FBI notification came from the official FBI.gov domain because hackers can't possibly spoof that, right?
No, it's impossible to spoof emails. Everyone knows that.
Well, we've definitely seen cases where the FBI attempts to notify an organization and the organization does not believe that they are actually being contacted by the FBI. Like, it's just too cool.
Well, I mean, think about that. Like, if you're a small service provider or something like that, and you get an email from the official FBI, are you going to think that's real or are you going to think that's spam?
I'm not cool enough for that. I'm not cool enough for that. So anyway, the issues that have come up are, number one, questions about ethics and if it's a data breach. Like if
Yeah.
Microsoft gains access to a server with lots of sensitive information, or the FBI, is that a data breach, or is it at least a security breach for you? There's the question of damages. What if because these are real changes that
Mhm.
are happening to a computer, changing the registry, changing configuration. So what if that impacts operations? What if the server crashes? Who is responsible for that?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Other issues are incident response and forensics. So when you're responding to a potential vulnerability, or if you think you've been hacked and you do a scan and you don't see any malware, what if it's because law enforcement has removed the malware? So we need to be planning for that, especially if you know
Yeah.
that there's an operation like this, like as in the case of Exchange, that has taken place. You need to be looking a little bit harder. And then finally, think about notifications and the notification process. So, Matt, do you want to talk about our final takeaways for listeners?
Sure. You mentioned this a little bit, but monitoring threat intelligence, paying attention to what's going on in the technology world around you becomes really important. We know about this because we read threat intelligence feeds, but they mentioned that a lot of people were not aware that, one, that this malware existed in the first place, and two, that
Right.
they would have been infected by it. And we saw with Exchange, I mean, the difference between when Microsoft released its patches for Exchange and when the FBI actually went into people's systems and removed these web shell was like a month.
Yeah, over a
So
month.
yeah, this is a long time for a lot of servers to remain infected on the internet, mainly because, I mean, I'm sure their admins just either didn't realize this exploit existed or didn't know there was a testing tool for it. And all of this is contained inside the threat intel briefings. Like, they don't take long to read. They're pretty informative, and they're pretty important. Yeah, other than that, I mean, we want to be aware of the fact that, like, things like this can happen. Like, law enforcement might come into one of your servers if it's internet facing if there's a problem. There's precedent, like you said, going back like a decade and a half on this. So
Yeah.
yeah, just, things to keep in mind.
And I would want to talk to my internet service provider about what they do when they get these notifications. Is your internet service provider watching out for notifications from the FBI?
Mhm.
And if they do get one, how long is it going to take them to contact you? That's important. Because you might need to preserve evidence if you've been hacked. For a
Right.
lot of people, this is the first notification that they've been hacked. Do they have the right contact information? So check and make sure that your ISP has the right contact information for someone in your organization, and that that person, or ideally group of people, is monitoring for these types of alerts.
Yeah.
And then you might also want to check your DNS registrars as well and make sure that your contact information is up to date there. And then finally, review your incident response and your forensics plans and make sure you're taking into account the fact that a third party might potentially access your systems. And I would recommend updating your tabletop exercises. When you run your next tabletop exercise, think about throwing a little curveball in there. Hey, the FBI came in and they already removed the web shell. You don't have access to the malware. Now what do you do?
I think I'm going
when
to
you're
add that to
analyzing
mine.
it?
That's
I
a
know.
great
I think
curveball
it's
to
an
throw in there.
interesting curveball. And
Yeah.
again, this type of activity has been going on for well over a decade, really almost 15 years at this point. So it's time for us to be thinking about it.
Yeah, totally.
So with that, thank you so much for tuning in. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.